He walked into court with a worn hat, a quiet step, and a history no one bothered to ask about. The judge laughed, the gallery snickered, and they all believed they knew who he was, but they didn't, because what they didn't know was who was about to walk through those doors, and what was about to be revealed. This isn't just another courtroom story. It's a moment of reckoning, of truth, of dignity that refused to disappear. If you believe in justice, if you've ever been underestimated, if you believe silence can be louder than shouting, then you're going to want to watch this to the very end. Subscribe now, because stories like this, they don't just inspire, they remind us of who we are and who we should never become. It began like any other morning in court. Files stacked neatly, pens tapping, voices murmuring beneath the marble ceiling. Another case, another defendant, another judge convinced he already knew the ending before the story began. But this case, this man, was different. He didn't arrive in handcuffs. He didn't storm in with protest or pride. He walked slowly, carefully, as if every step reminded him of time. His name was Elias Monroe, 79 years old, black, alone. He wore a modest gray suit, frayed gently at the cuffs, polished shoes scuffed from decades of roads. In his hand, a battered fedora, worn, respected, carried like a memory. No one stood when he entered. No one paused to see him. To most, he was just another old man, another tired body on trial, another file number on the docket. The judge, Richard Danton, didn't lift his head right away. When he did, he smirked. Just for a second. It wasn't personal. Not to him. He simply saw what he always saw. A story already written. A man already sentenced in his mind. The courtroom buzzed with that invisible electricity that only arrogance can generate. Clerks clicked pens with authority. Lawyers checked their watches. The gallery murmured. And Elias? He walked forward. Alone. Steady. When the bailiff called his case, there was no drama, just his name. State of Georgia versus Elias Monroe. Charge: unlawful occupation of condemned property. Elias nodded. No lawyer stood beside him. No family in the gallery. Whispered comfort. Just him. And silence. And a truth too long ignored. Judge Danton leaned back, his robe folding like armor. He tapped his pen against the desk. Once. Twice. Another one, he muttered. Then louder. Mr. Monroe, I assume you know why you're here? Elias looked up, his voice calm, low, certain. I believe so, Your Honor. There was no trembling, no anger, only the quiet weight of someone who had spent a lifetime waiting to be heard. The judge chuckled. The gallery followed. Laughter, shallow and cold. But Elias didn't flinch, because he knew something none of them did. The story wasn't over, not even close. What followed wasn't just another court proceeding. It was a reckoning, a collision between pride and patience, between arrogance and history. And when the dust finally settled, someone in that room would walk away forever changed. But it wouldn't be him. The judge leaned forward, his voice sharp, his tone dismissive. You were found trespassing on condemned property. A house scheduled for demolition. What possible reason could you have for being there, Mr. Monroe? Elias stood, still, hands gently folded, no shaking, no rush. He took a quiet breath, then said, I was sitting on the porch. That's all. The room paused. Just for a second, the simplicity of the answer caught the judge off guard. On the porch of a condemned house, he asked mockingly. Nostalgia doesn't make it legal. Elias didn't react. His gaze drifted toward the high windows, where streaks of morning light pulled across the dusty courtroom. Then he spoke again, softly, slowly. It's the last place that remembers me. The last place I remember belonging. And just like that, the air shifted, some heads turned, some eyes lowered. The courtroom, that had just laughed, now held its breath. Judge Danton tapped his pen, harder this time. covering discomfort. With irritation, "This isn't a confessional, Mr. Monroe. This is a court of law." But Elias didn't flinch. He didn't argue. His silence was louder than protest, stronger than rage. The judge narrowed his eyes. "You were warned to stay off that property, weren't you?" "Yes, Your Honor. And yet you returned?" "I did." "Why?" Elias paused, then answered with a single line that would ripple through every heart in that room. "Because memory," he said, "isn't something you can evict." The words hung heavy, heavier than the judge's robe, heavier than the charge itself. Even the court reporter stopped typing. Even the prosecutor looked up, her pen frozen mid-air. But Judge Danton scoffed. "This is about facts," he barked, "not feelings." Still, Elias remained composed. He bowed his head slightly, not in defeat but in restraint. Because dignity isn't loud, it doesn't shout, it doesn't demand. It waits, and it holds, and it endures. The judge slammed the folder shut. "If you have nothing else to say for yourself, we'll proceed to sentencing." The gallery tensed. Even the walls seemed to listen harder. But Elias didn't move, didn't blink, didn't break, because he knew the courtroom wasn't his judge. Not really, and the sentence wouldn't define him. The silence grew thicker than ever, a silence that didn't beg for mercy. It demanded reflection. Elias stood not like a man caught, but like a man who had survived too many verdicts to care about one more. And somewhere in that stillness, something started to crack. Not in Elias, but in the room around him. Judge Danton rested his elbows on the bench. His fingers formed a steeple beneath his chin. He looked down at Elias Monroe, but he didn't really see him. His face held no trace of thought, only conclusion. He had already made up his mind. The rest was just performance. He cleared his throat, spoke slowly, formally, but there was no heart in it. "The court has considered the facts," he began. His voice echoed across the marble walls. "It is clear the defendant knowingly trespassed on condemned city property, in violation of official orders." Elias remained still, his face unreadable but not hard, just settled. A ray of light fell across his folded hands. Wrinkled skin. Still, patient. "In light of Mr. Monroe's prior citation," the judge continued, "and his willful disregard for the law, this court finds it necessary to impose a consequence, one that reflects the seriousness of repeated behavior." He paused, waiting for a reaction, a plea, a collapse, but Elias gave him none, not a flinch, not a word, just calm. The judge's lips tightened. He looked away for a moment, then returned his gaze with a flick of finality. "The defendant is hereby sentenced to 30 days in the Lancaster County Jail. Effective immediately," the words dropped like bricks. The courtroom inhaled. Sharp, short, uncomfortable, even. The prosecutor lowered her pen. Even the clerks shifted in their chairs. Elias bowed his head slightly, not in surrender, but in acknowledgement. He wasn't surprised. He had known. The judge tapped the gavel. Once. "Court is adjourned." The sound was smug, final. The bailiff approached, cuffs in hand, but Elias didn't move, didn't resist. He rose slowly, gathered his fedora, brushed it gently with one thumb, as if dusting off memory. Then he waited, standing at the defense table, like a man preparing for a Sunday walk, not a jail cell. And the room was silent, not because of fear, but because of shame. The kind that crawls under your skin when you realize you've witnessed something deeply wrong, and said nothing. Judge Danton stacked his papers briskly, trying to feel justified, trying to feel right, but his fingers trembled just enough to betray him, because deep down, even he knew. This wasn't justice. It was theater. And Elias Monroe had just stolen the stage without saying a word. Elias looked across the room, met the judge's eyes, and held them. No hate, no bitterness, only quiet disappointment, That stare cut deeper than any outburst ever could. The judge looked away first. The bailiff hesitated, then finally raised the cuffs. "Any final words?" he asked under his breath. Elias smiled faintly, a tired, knowing smile. "Not yet," he said, and the room had no idea what was about to walk through that door. The bailiff stepped closer. The handcuffs hung silently between them. Elias didn't flinch, didn't pull away. He just looked at the man quietly. And then, he asked, "Before I'm taken away, may I request one thing?" The judge didn't look up. He was already thumbing through the next case file. "What's that, Mr. Monroe?" he replied, not even glancing in Elias's direction. "A phone call." He chuckled under his breath, but Elias just nodded once. There was no drama, no demand, only a simple truth behind calm eyes. The judge waved his hand dismissively. "Fine. One call, 1 minute. Bailiff, give him your phone." The bailiff hesitated just for a second, then handed over a battered department-issued phone. Elias took it with quiet care, like it was something sacred. He didn't scroll, didn't search. He just dialed from memory. Every digit smooth, certain, like it had been waiting inside him to rise. Just this moment, the courtroom began to shift. Not loudly, but subtly. Some heads turned, some eyes followed. There was something about the way Elias held the phone. Like it wasn't a request for help, but a signal. He raised it to his ear. It rang, once, twice, then, click, connection. And then, he spoke. 4 words, barely above a whisper. But somehow they reached every corner of that courtroom. "It's time," he said. "Bring them." He ended the call, handed the phone back with a nod, folded his hands in front of him once more. Still, centered, silent. The bailiff stared for a moment too long, then motioned him gently toward the exit. But the air in the room, it had changed, not loudly, not obviously, just enough that people noticed something was off, like the moment before a storm. Still, tense, the judge tried to ignore it. He shuffled papers, stacked files, muttered under his breath. "Probably calling for a ride," he scoffed. "Or someone to cry to." He laughed, alone, but even he noticed. The bailiff didn't laugh. The prosecutor didn't smile. And the gallery, they leaned forward, not because they knew what was coming, but because they suddenly realized something was. Elias walked toward the courtroom door, his steps slow, measured, unshaken, and on. His face, a small smile, not of pride, not of defiance, but of certainty. The kind of smile you wear when you know the winds are already shifting. And outside that door, they were coming. Not revenge, not spectacle, but truth. And truth, unlike verdicts, doesn't wait for permission. The courtroom was sinking back into routine. The next file thudded onto the judge's desk. The bailiff adjusted his stance. The clerk resumed typing, and Elias Monroe was only steps from the door. Then, it happened. Click, click, click. The sharp, precise sound of heels on polished marble cut through the noise like thunder through still air. Every head turned. Every voice halted. Even the bailiff stopped mid-step, and the double doors swung open. Not gently. Not quietly, but with force, with purpose, with presence. A woman stepped inside, tall, poised, commanding. She wore a fitted black suit, not flashy, but perfect, crisp seams, every line tailored, every button gleaming. In one hand, a slim leather briefcase, in the other, nothing, because she didn't need anything else. Her name was Naomi Monroe, doctor, attorney, constitutional scholar, civil rights powerhouse, and she wasn't just Elias's daughter. She was a storm that had just entered the room, behind her. 3 attorneys in matching navy suits, each carrying laptops, folders, documents that felt heavier than the judge's. Gavel. Their footsteps made no sound, but their presence spoke volumes. The room froze. Judge Danton's pen hung mid-air. His smugness flickered, but only for a second. He straightened in his chair, lifted his chin. "Excuse me," he called out louder than necessary. "This proceeding has concluded. If you don't have business here." But Naomi never broke stride. She walked straight down the center aisle, measured, unhurried, inevitable, as if the walls themselves made room for her. She reached her father, stopped, said nothing. He turned. Their eyes met. No words. None needed. She placed one hand gently on his shoulder, then looked straight at the judge, her eyes calm, clear, unblinking. "Your Honor," she said, her voice firm but composed. "There are documents you must see." She lifted the briefcase. It looked light, but everyone in that courtroom knew it carried the full weight of truth. She stepped forward, placed the folder on the bench. Not roughly, not carelessly, just precisely. The sound it made was louder than any gavel. "These are certified records," Naomi continued. "They pertain to the legal ownership of the property in question." Judge Danton stared at the folder, didn't move. The room leaned in, spectators, clerks, even lawyers held their breath. Then he opened it, one page, then another, and slowly, his face changed, no longer smug, no longer sure. Inside that folder were deeds, titles, court archives, proof that Elias Monroe still owned that house, that the city never completed the legal transfer, that his trespassing had never existed, and beyond that, service records, engineering certifications, awards. Elias Monroe had helped build the very systems this judge sat beneath. He wasn't just innocent, he was owed. The room went silent, not in shock, in shame, because now everyone knew. The courtroom didn't breathe. Judge Danton stared at the documents. He flipped page after page, his hands slower now, less certain. His face, no longer smug, no longer in control, because control had left the bench and taken its seat beside Elias. Monroe, Naomi stood still, unmoving. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her presence said everything. Beside her, Elias remained calm, still, the same man they had tried to cuff just minutes earlier. Judge Danton cleared his throat. The sound cracked. He looked up, but not at Elias. At the truth, now sitting in front of him. He opened his mouth, paused, then finally spoke. "In light of the new evidence, the sentence against Mr. Monroe is hereby vacated. All charges are dismissed, immediately." He dropped the gavel. It didn't echo with power. It fell like a whisper at a funeral. The gallery didn't cheer, didn't clap. They watched. Eyes wide, hearts heavy, because they had seen something few ever do, a system crack in real time. The bailiff stepped back, hands down, no cuffs, no escort. Even the young prosecutor lowered her head. Ashamed, Elias Monroe didn't gloat. Didn't smile, he just stood, straight, dignified, and turned to face the people who had judged him without knowing him. He didn't speak, but his silence was deafening. Judge Danton avoided his gaze. Completely. Naomi reached for her father's arm. "Let's go home," she whispered. They walked down the aisle together, slow, steady, free, and the room parted. Not out of fear, but respect. Real respect. The kind that can't be demanded, only earned. Elias Monroe had walked into that courtroom alone, forgotten. He walked out, a reminder. That dignity doesn't need a microphone, or a podium, or a robe. It just needs to stand. They stepped outside into the morning sun, brighter now, sharper. Reporters rushed forward, microphones raised. "Mr. Monroe, do you have a statement?" He paused, lifted his fedora, smiled softly. "I wasn't looking for justice," he said. "I was looking for memory." Then he placed his hat back on his head and walked down the steps with his daughter by his side. Not a defendant, not a file number, but a legacy. No courtroom could erase. Long after the reporters packed up, the files were closed. And the judge went home to his silence. Elias Monroe's truth would remain, because in the end it wasn't the law that set him free. It was a lifetime that refused to be silenced. Sometimes justice doesn't come from the bench. It walks in quietly, waits patiently, and speaks only when the world is finally ready to listen. Elias Monroe didn't raise his voice. He didn't demand to be seen, but he stood. And in standing, he reminded every one of us that dignity cannot be sentenced, and truth, it doesn't ask for permission. So the next time you're quick to judge, remember Elias. Remember silence. Remember what happened when a courtroom thought it held all the power and forgot the power of presence. If this story moved you, share it. Let someone else see what real strength looks like, and never forget, you don't need a title to change everything. You just need the courage to stand.